Hi, my name is Wayne, and this is Type Tested. So, I recently got in another Lettera 22. This is not the typewriter that I've mentioned in previous videos. This is a different one. And I've begun the process of cleaning up. I stripped the body off. But before I could do that, there was a problem with the escapement I needed to evaluate to see if it was worth cleaning up. Because if it's not fixable, then it's parts. In this case, because of the way that Olivetti designed their typewriters, in order to get at the escapement, I had to completely remove the carriage. That's not something I really advise doing, but in this particular case, Olivetti has made it reasonably simple. So what I've done here is I moved the drawstring to one of the frame screws, which I have reinstalled, and used that as a point to park it so I don't have to detension the mainspring. And there's a system of rollers and guides here that keep the carriage in place so that I won't lose any ball bearings or anything like that by taking it off. The only thing I had to do after that was remove the margin assembly, and the carriage would come off to my right, the typewriter's left. And no big deal. But when you're putting it back together, you do have to make sure that you very carefully line things up and get everything in the correct position and don't bend anything when you do it, or it's not going to work right when you get done. So I don't really advise this, but if you're going to do a proper job cleaning the escapement on a 22, you almost have to. And remember, this typewriter requires a certain clearance when it's out of its case, so you do have to prop it up, and even this is going to interfere with some of the things. It's not exactly the easiest one to work on. Anyway, the point of this video is that while I have this out, it seemed that this provided a really nice opportunity to discuss the escapements in a typewriter, what they are, how they function, and what triggers them. And since this one was in place and functional and so very easily visible and accessible, I thought this made a really good candidate to do that. So that's what this video is for. So the first question is, what is the escapement? Well, the escapement is what provides the motive force for the carriage. It's what allows the carriage to move down the line on the page as we type. Its purpose really isn't anything beyond that, because the motive force for a type bar is provided by the downward force of your fingers on the keys, the same thing with the space bar. It does allow the tab to operate, and it does allow the margin or the carriage release to operate, but the shift is also mechanical, as is the backspace, though the backspace does interact with this. So really, its primary job is to draw the carriage to the left, since we type left to right, as we move. And it's not really anything terribly complicated. It's derived off the mechanism from a watch. That's why you see any kind of mechanism like this, especially any sort of wind-up mechanism, we would call it just a wind-up toy. In England, they would call it a clockwork toy, because the gears and spring and power release is derived from the clock mechanism. So this escapement is a clockwork. Now, the parts of the escapement are this. First, we have the pinion gear. Let me zoom in here so you can see what I'm talking about more readily. Move this where it belongs and get the typewriter in position. So here's the pinion gear. It's just your basic gear. It's just a little small gear. And that merges with the rack. You've heard of rack and pinion. Well, that's what this is. So we have a rack of gear teeth that are in a straight line and a pinion that meshes with them. And that determines the spacing and position of the carriage on the typewriter. Below this, and usually it's integrated as a single piece, though some do allow them to move separately. Some cases they're fixed together, some cases they're made together. Doesn't really matter. This is the escapement gear, more commonly called the star wheel because of its appearance. And I'm a technical person, I prefer escapement gear, but star wheel will do. Next to this, we have a rocker plate, which, as the name implies, rocks up and down on these two pivots right here. Let me get some light on it. So there's one pivot, and there's the other. Now in this case, this particular pivot is fixed, this one is not. The screw that you see here is not so much for positioning, but it's for locking it in place and providing a certain amount of tension, although it still has to be free to move on its own. So to adjust that, you undo this locking nut here, and there's a slot here that you can get a screwdriver into to back it off, so that you can either adjust the tension or remove the escapement entirely. If it's too tight, it's not going to move the way it's supposed to. So it needs to be held in there so that it can move without working its way out. Now, what we have in this particular design is a loose dog, and down below, you can see it just between these two teeth here, and it's kind of hard to see, but you can still get a pretty good view on it. That right there is the fixed tooth, which some designs call the fixed dog. We also have a spring here, and there's another spring which connects onto this little stud right here. If I move this out of the way, you can see it. So that little stud that pulls the rocker plate back down after a motion. So now you can imagine the carriage in place and the rack meshed up against the pinion gear here, the drawstring attached to the carriage pulling it in this direction. So let me use my thumb to provide that force. You can see that what happens when this is locked up in place, this tooth on the escapement gear, or the star wheel, will rest against this tooth on the loose dog. And that will hold the escapement in place so the carriage just doesn't fly off to the left. Now, if I press a key and a type bar, there is, let me show you this drawing here from the maintenance manual. There is what's called a flank on the type bar. And that pushes against a semicircular bar, which is called the universal bar. Universal because every key operates that bar. So don't get caught up on the name. It's also just abbreviated as the U-bar. That U-bar is right here. That's what this little black thing is here. So if I move a key, you can see the U-bar move. And if nothing jams it up, and I'm not holding something in the wrong position, you can see it move and return back to its rest position. That is done by the flank depressing the bar, which then causes this little extension here to push up against that stud. So here's the extension, if I can get it in camera. So here's the extension, and here's the stud. So you can see that there. This stud is part of a screw which has a lock nut here. That is for adjusting the trip position. Every unit will have something similar, but it may not be exactly the same form. So you have to study your mechanism out before you adjust the trip. Now, when properly assembled, when properly adjusted, the trip point should happen just as the type bar is entering the V of the type guide. And some have it very, very close, some have it a little bit further out. I tend to like it to trip just about right there, just as it's coming, just as the face of the type head is coming parallel to the V of the type guide. If you have it too close, what's going to happen is it's going to tend to rebound, and it can cause skipping because it trips the escapement again, or it will bounce back on a hard platen and give you that ghosting that you see on some texty type. So if I use my thumb here to provide the force of the drawstring in the carriage, and I press a key, you can see every time I press a key, the escapement moves. So now, if I draw one of these up by hand, and I can do that on this particular typewriter, some you have to press a key to get that to happen. The first thing that happens is the rocker plate comes up, and the tooth the gear tooth will slip off of the tooth on the loose dog and be caught by the fixed tooth or fixed dog. The loose dog then moves back away from it so that it is in position to be able to catch the tooth, the next tooth, as the loose dog or the fixed dog slips away from the tooth and the loose dog can re-engage. If I pull it up again, you can see that happen again. So, slips off the loose dog, catches on the fixed dog, slips off the fixed dog, catches on the loose dog. And then typewriter is back at rest and ready for the next movement. And it's just that simple. So we have the trip adjustment down here. We have the loose dog, the fixed dog, the teeth on the escapement gear. And I will note that the escapement gear will have a different number of teeth depending on the type, the size of the type. So a 10 pitch or a 12 pitch or a 6 pitch or a 15 pitch will have a different number of teeth. And likewise, the rack will have a different size. So people think they can just change the size of the text or the size of the type by replacing the type bars. No, you can't do that. You have to replace the escapement, you have to replace the rack, and if you're going to adjust the number of lines per inch, well, you have to change the gear on the, you have to change the gear on the platen and the platen drive as well. So if you want a different size text, just buy the right size typewriter. That's all I can say. And if you have a typewriter that moves right to left for like Hebrew or one of those others that use right to left typing, I think Arabic does the same, what you have is this reflected. The gears of the star wheel have to point in the opposite direction, as does the tooth on the loose dog. So the spring barrel is mounted over on this side, and the gears here are reflected, and the carriage ends up moving that direction as you type instead of that direction. Otherwise, everything happens identically. Now, there are other things to interact with the escapement that are worth talking about. The first is the backspace. So on the backspace, if I hit the key, you can see that this wire here is moving. That is connected to a little plate right here, which has an offset in it, right there on the inside, which then connects to this arm here, this extension arm here. That connects to this pivot, which connects to this arm, which has a tooth on it, and a semicircular slot in here. It also has a spring back here. Now on the backspace key, there are a set of springs up here, so the backspace key also has its own key lever return spring right there. So the two things that are returning this to its position are the key lever return spring and the backspace arm spring right here. I don't know if that's the correct name, but we'll accept that. So as I press the backspace, you will see that this tooth will come down, engage the star wheel, push it back the other direction. It will cause the star wheel to slip past the loose dog, and then as you release, and as it does that, as you press the backspace, the loose dog is pushed out of the way. And then as I release the backspace key, the gear will come back in, the loose dog will return to its normal position, and it will catch on the previous tooth of the star wheel. So you can see there, every time I press, I'm backing up one gear. Now, as I push the carriage return, one thing that will happen is that this tooth, as I said, will push the loose dog out of the way, and you hear that kind of clicking. That is the star wheel brushing up against the loose dog. In some cases, people decided that that was undesirable. That's what this little stud here is for. Now, if I turn this over, and I'll show you the other side, you'll see that there's a hole here where the other half of that stud is visible. And this hole also serves to limit its length of travel. It's not really meant to just be decorative. It also gives access for cleaning. So if you need to spray chemicals in there, that's the best point. So this is attached to a spring, a torsion spring, which wraps around the pivot for the pinion and escapement gear. And as I move the carriage back, this will push the loose dog out of the way so that the teeth don't rub against the tooth on the loose dog. And I get a silent return, which is why that is called the silent return mechanism, or in some cases, the silent return spring. So let me put the carriage back on here. It's something of a delicate process. It's not difficult. Again, I just have to make sure everything is properly lined up, that nothing is interfering. So here we have all the tab pins. Here we have all the tab pins. And you'll notice this little bit right here is your tab set clear. So if I go to set a tab, this will push one of those pins back so it is now on the opposite side of the bar. And if I want to clear it, I move the tab the other direction and this plate comes forward and pushes it back. Now, if I have 3 or 4 tabs set in a row, that tab clear is wide enough that it will push all of them back. Not exactly sure why this is, but it makes sure that you don't miss. And I mean, usually you don't have 2 tabs set side by side anyway. So let me go ahead and set that tab. And I will show you that what happens as I press the tab key. So the first thing that will happen is that this will move this, that the key will move this lever up right here. Okay. See if you can see that on camera. That right there will move up. The loose dog will get pushed forward. The carriage will be allowed to move freely until the tab stop hits the stop bar. Then as you release the tab key, that goes back down and the carriage is able to, locks again with the escapement and it's able to move freely. Just as it's supposed to. The other component that operates with the escapement is the carriage release. And of course, that is that lever here. Now, this is a little bit different than other typewriters, but in a way I kind of like it more. So you see this stud here, which is pointing upward from the loose dog. And it's not on the diagram that I have, so I can't use that to point it out. But in any event, it's roughly right here on the diagram. You can see it here. When I press the carriage release, this silver plate moves forward. I'm not sure why the whole plate has to move, but what it does is it pushes against that stud and pushes the loose dog back from the star wheel. So now it's able to move freely. On most other systems, what will happen is the rack will get moved downward and disengage with the pinion. As in those escapements, the star wheel is on the top, not the bottom. So, but even if it is this way, it would move up instead of down, but it accomplishes the same thing just by a different mechanism. Now the interesting thing here is that because the star wheel is fully engaged, because the pinion is fully engaged, the star wheel moves in both directions. That's in some ways wasted motion, but in the systems that move the rack, what can happen is that as you press one button, because it has springs on both sides to draw it back, you can have it moving so that one side moves further down than the other. And that can cause, as you get to one end or the other, the carriage return to start kind of grinding on the pinion. So if you hear that sound, then that's a pretty good indication that your margin bar or your margin release is not releasing the rack properly. So let me take this off again so I can point out what I've been talking about. Come on, get over there. There we go. So again, here's the stud. This is the lever for the tab key to push the loose dog away. So there's where the margin release operates. There's where the tab operates. And the universal bar will then simply pull it down to engage once, whereas these two, they disengage it completely because the carriage is expected to move a decent amount each time. So that is the fundamentals of an escapement. I did forget to mention one thing, the space bar. The space bar is connected to this wire here. Let me zoom back out so I can show you this. And so from the pivot, this wire connects up to here. Now I can flex this out and show you that it's not actually attached. It's just in here by positioning, and it will push up against the back of this little pivot, of this little, I don't know what you'd call it, but one way or the other, it pushes against this extension off the rocker plate, and just as a type bar would move that tab from through the universal bar, this does the same thing, but without a type bar raising because, well, you're not trying to get a type bar to raise. Anyway, so that is the fundamentals of the escapement. Now let me grab another typewriter and I can show you some of the differences in that particular mechanism because it's got something interesting that is not present in this one. So I now have in front of me a Smith Corona Silent Super. This is a typewriter I cleaned up not too long ago. It cleaned up very well and it's a great typer. Now let me turn this over. I can show you some of the differences between this and the Olivetti. So once again, as I press a key, so you can see that in this case, what we have here is really a fixed dog, and the loose dog is down here. So let me zoom in so you can see that. Move the camera and the typewriter. So this is now more of a fixed dog, and that back here is a loose dog. You can see that it moves just there. As I press a key, the escapement slips off of the fixed dog, right here, gets grabbed by the loose dog, but here's an interesting variation. The loose dog then moves back to meet the level of the fixed dog. And as the rocker plate returns to its normal position, it goes right back where it came from. There's no secondary movement. If I press the space bar, the same thing happens. So the way this works, if I press a type bar, you still have the universal bar, which, if I can bring this up to show it, is this silver thing right back. It's this silver thing right back here. That is the universal bar. So as I press a key, you can see that that moves. And the carriage moves every time it's pressed. Now there is a difference here in that the space bar, what it does is it is connected through a rod, or I guess you could call it a rod, that goes all the way back from the space bar pivot back here and pulls on the side of the rocker plate at this tab right here. So you can see that it's moving with the little slot, and it will pull forward, if I can orient this correctly. You can see that as I press the space bar, it pushes the rocker plate forward and releases the escapement. So it's not acting on the universal bar, it's acting independently. If I hit the backspace, find the key, that is this lever here, which if you can see clearly, zoom in again, we have this bit here which contacts the tooth on the star wheel, pulls it back, and allows the dog to re-engage. So as I pull this back, it slips past this, kind of fixed dog. And it catches on the next gear, on the next tooth over. So if I then hit the carriage return, that's going to be hard to do to show you with the typewriter elevated like this. What has to happen is that it will release. So if I hit the carriage return, you can see, you can hear it as it drags across the dog. So there's no silent return on this. However, there is another mechanism which is equally interesting. And that is this set of springs here. So we have a spring here. We have two springs underneath right here. This is a tab brake. What its purpose is to prevent the carriage from slamming out the other side as you press a tab. Now, obviously, that's not going to be present on typewriters that do not have a tab system because it's not necessary. So if I zoom out again and I show you that action, you can kind of hear that there's a little bit of a whining. And that is the tab brake. So turn this over again so you can see it in operation. Bring my camera, take my camera off the stand, get it down over here. So if I press the tab key, which is over here, and I don't have the carriage being interfered with, you can see the tab activating the braking spring. So the spring, that big spring, stretches out to provide some resistance, and then the two springs underneath it provide drag so that it doesn't accelerate quickly and then stays at a consistent tension as it travels across the carriage. So you'll find that in a few machines too, most particularly a Smith Corona, because they were really big about the tab brake. So you see the escapement operates a little bit differently on this typewriter. Nevertheless, the same principles still apply. It's just implemented in a little bit different manner. And like the other one, this too is fairly easily removable. You just have to pay attention to what happens with the carriage when you do. I also want to show you that if I hit the carriage release, you can see that in this case, that what happens is that it actually moves the rack forward or the rack downward to disengage from the pinion. However, if I do that, it can create some problems with re-engagement. Like here, it's not exactly on a tooth. Slips and then it re-engages. So that is one little problem that can occur with this mechanism, but it's minor, and all it takes is a little bit of movement and everything moves back into place. So that being said, we put this back on the stand. And there we have the Smith Corona Silent Super mechanism. Now, that was introduced in the 5 series, which is what this is. The 4 series, I don't think had it. I know the 3s and the 2s didn't. So earlier mechanisms are going to look a little bit differently, but they all function the same. So you'll find some variations on different typewriters. You may find the universal bar, instead of being behind the escapement, is back here somewhere. For example, this white bar here, that's not actually a universal bar, but it can be kind of considered one. It's called the ribbon universal bar, because what its function is to move the ribbon lifter up and to trigger the ribbon advance. So every key has to hit it as well, but the space bar doesn't. So it only advances when there's a character typed. To better illustrate the escapement itself, I now have a Smith Corona clipper. Now you'll notice that this typewriter does not have a tab key. So the tab brake is not present. Therefore, as I turn this over, you can see the entire escapement. So here we have the star wheel. Here we have the rocker plate. There's the backspace arm. And the margin release, as noted, is physically moving the margin bar, or the carriage release, that is. So everything operates just the same. So if I bring this up and zoom in, so there's a typed character, and I've got the typewriter resting on the carriage, so the typewriter is moving and not the carriage, but it's the same idea. So press, gear slips, release, gear slips back, loose dog returns, and there we are. If I hit the backspace, it should be right there, pulls the tooth, pushes the fixed dog out of the way, and then catches on it. Just that simple. So you can see that everything is basically the same. The only difference is this bit here. So it doesn't actually have a fixed dog, but that's what I'm going to call this, because that's its function, except on backspace. But again, as I move the carriage return, you can see that the carriage is winding up against the fixed dog, pushing it out of the way, and so the carriage is acting against the fixed dog, pushing it out of the way as the star wheel rotates backwards, and you get that classic typewriter return sound, the bit that Leroy Anderson loves so well. Anyway, so as I said, that's the fundamentals of the escapement on 3 different typewriters, 2 different brands. And whatever typewriter you use, you're going to have a similar function. As you can see, it's implemented a little bit differently, one brand to another, but it all functions pretty much the same. So don't be intimidated by the escapement. It's just a mechanism. Anyway, once again, my name is Wayne, and this is Type Tested.